Good morning and welcome to the session that's going to be looking at the understanding and development of sector-level just transition pathways, focusing on the multi-stakeholder approach that has been used to South Africa's NDC, and we'll be focusing specifically on the power sector as part of the session. We will be having speakers from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, as well as Business Unity South Africa and the National Business Initiative, to get a better insight into how we have gone about this in the power sector in particular. I would like to go through the meeting protocols. Just noting that we are hosting this event using a hybrid approach. You're welcome to submit any questions that you may have, particularly online using the Q&A function, and in the in-person event, you may raise your hand. Just to make sure to our panelists that you make sure that your microphone is muted and your video is turned off if you're not speaking, for those who are joining us online. And also please note that the session is being recorded, and if you have any technical issues, you're welcome to contact one of the team who's available to assist in that regard. Okay. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. Without much ado rather, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Seleki from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, who's going to give us a bit more insight into South Africa's NDC before we proceed. Kutazi, please come forward.
Oh, sorry. If I may, let me take off this. Oh, good day, good morning once again, colleagues. It's good to be here with you this morning. Earlier on in the day, we delivered this presentation, but to a different audience. The focus is on South Africa's NDC. We ran a research process that informed, the targets and the components of the NDC that we'll be sharing with you. That research was on mitigation, adaptation, and the corresponding means of implementation. We were funded by the NDC partnership. We were also assisted, by other entities in terms of research. Entities such as NBI also contributed thoughts on research in terms of what should, be considered in the target and so forth. That was consulted upon extensively across, sectors within provinces within South Africa. Then it was ultimately put through the cluster system and approved by cabinet towards the end of September, at which point it then got submitted to the UNFCCC. The precursor to this was the initial NDC that was submitted in 2016. It was then updated, and now we have this update with us. I'll take you through that. Key amongst the considerations, taken on board from under Paris is the progression, the fact that parties are encouraged to demonstrate progression relative, to the NDC that was submitted earlier, but also to consider the angle of reaching the highest possible, ambition. And overarchingly, the Article 2, objective of the Paris Agreement that will limit, temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and even steer towards 1.5 degrees, Celsius. But also recently there's been an IPCC report, because we uphold, the fact that our position and what we consider should be on the basis of science, and the latest science from the Working Group 1, as it came out from IPCC, emphasize the urgency of all countries, to reduce their GHGs, greenhouse gases, even faster. But also the national context. We had to consider the fact that we need to take into account aspects such as poverty, unemployment, inequality, and we are faced with an economy that is growing at a very low rate. Actually, we took a shock when COVID landed. Even prior to COVID, we were in a technical recession already. So we had to balance all those considerations as we worked, on the NDC. In terms of its form, it has those components. It balances mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. We had a similar form as well when we submitted in 2015. That's actually aligned to how we articulate ambition as South Africa, as a developing country, that ambition to us is broad. It takes into account all those considerations. The two key pillars, mitigation, adaptation, but also enablers. But when you drill into the NDC, you will also do note that we have expressed how we have arrived at certain, at the targets, where we have put forward a table that explains properly what assumptions have been taken into account, so that our NDC provides clarity, is transparent, it provides a better understanding in line with the agreements that come from, under the convention. If we start with adaptation component, the focus is more on the goals. We have incorporated into the NDC what we refer to as adaptation communication. From Katowice COP24, parties agreed that there would have to be a submission by parties, adaptation communication. In our case, of the two options that were there, we have opted to have it incorporated as part of the NDC itself. And you want to focus on the middle column on goals, where informed by the various elements A to E, as you see there on the first column, we came up with goals. And that's where I would prefer your attention to be, that we seek to enhance, as the first goal, climate change adaptation, governance, and legal framework. The flagship initiative there is the climate change bill, yet to be an act because it's still being taken through the domestic, processes and so forth. Secondly, is the goal of having to develop an understanding of impacts under different scenarios in relation to the Paris, goals, temperature goals to well below 2 degrees, but also towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. Those implications have corresponding, requirements, both in terms of the necessary means to adapt and to also make sure that we enhance, our resilience and so forth. Thirdly, we have made as a goal work that has already been carried out in terms of research and actually policy articulation, which is expressed through the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which has got 9 objectives, which cuts across, what key priorities and actions need to be prioritized within sectors. That's our third goal. And then fourthly, because there's a skewed, focus when it comes to funding, both bilaterally, multilaterally, and so forth, a focus which is more in the direction of mitigation. And we thought it will be fair of us that adaptation is prioritized, that adaptation does not lag, because in South Africa, and of course in any other developing countries, these impacts are even more, they are escalating as we go forward and so forth. Therefore, resource mobilization for adaptation requires a particular focus. Then fifthly, as the goal, we have the quantification of efforts. Here we seek to estimate that which we will have drawn from the fiscus and has been geared towards adaptation. We want a recognition of that towards the global goal on adaptation. So those are the goals, and would prefer to highlight those. Take note that the details there are the priority actions that correspond with each of the goals. And in the detailed document that has been submitted, there's a table that outlines, the costing, the cost projections, basically, over a 10-year horizon, 2020 to 2030, in terms of what the estimated costs and needs will be to enable each of those goals and the corresponding, activities that is congruent with each of the goals. And then shifting to the mitigation component, in the 2016 NDC that we submitted, it received a lot of criticism, especially from the likes of your climate action tracker, that it was not sufficiently ambitious, that it was not consistent with limiting, temperature to the 2-degree world and even 1.5-degree world. So we considered all of those, and now what we have submitted actually is a mitigation target that has 2 5-year implementation periods, and the critical time points are your 2025 and 2030. And do take note of the applicable, lower and upper bound figures. So we have moved from 614 that was there in 2016 when we submitted. We're saying our upper figure for 2025 is 510 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, whilst the lower bound in 2025 will be 398 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That translates to a difference or an improvement of 17% when you compare it to what we previously submitted, because we were saying 614 megatons in when we submitted the 2016 NDC, right? Now moving into 2030, the improvement is even, much more better, to say that our emissions will be limited on the upper side at 420 megatons, whilst on the lower side, contracting now the range, on the lower side, it will be 350 megatons by 2030. In overall, that translates to an improvement of 32% over the total period, right? So that's progression, which we believe we have demonstrated. We also did a further fair shares analysis on mitigation, which in essence says that to what extent are we contributing to the 2-degree world? And you may want to see for yourself in terms of what is projected on the Climate Action Tracker website, that we are almost, having a sufficiently ambitious, they say almost, they put a qualifier, but maybe that's for another day, because there were methodologies that changed, over the duration, but at least we have demonstrated progression, and we believe we are closer to the 2-degree world. It's not a single shot, but that's the determination that South Africa has, towards contributing to a better, climate and an environment in the world. Thirdly, is the component on support. What we are saying on support, over the period of implementation of the first NDC, we have a view of having to achieve a floor of $8 billion per annum by 2030. That's the per annum figure. It's not the complete, figure necessarily, but it will enable us to mobilize further resources, over and above that. That clarity is key to us. And this should be distributed on a 50-50 spread, between mitigation, but also adaptation as a matter of principle. So that's what we are saying. There's work that informs that figure in terms of the estimates, because we gauged the extent of the flows of support bilaterally and multilaterally and what it means for the foreseeable future. That figure in 2025, it translates to about $4.5 billion per annum for 2025. Then the relevant policies, primarily, that will enable us to steer towards that mitigation target is the Integrated Resource Plan 2019 in the energy electricity sector, because therein you will see that there's a schedule in terms of the phase out plan, for the coal power plants and all of that. and also, other assumptions that they have taken on board, like the scale and the extent to which, renewables will be introduced, and supported within the economy. Then there's the green transport strategy as well, which has got its own targets in terms of what emissions will be cut within the transport sector. The energy efficiency programs will also enable, that kind of transition. But also carbon tax will also, assist us in moving forward. This is not a complete suite of policies. There's still further work to be done, because that ambition takes us beyond what can be carried by these policies. But we thought it's key of us to express, our ambition with the understanding that the necessary support will come from the international, players. Hence the note there. The implementation of these ambitious mitigation targets will require substantial multilateral support as provided for under Paris. South Africa is updating these mitigation targets in the expectation that such support will be available, taken as is, from the NDC, that particular line, and it's key that we underscore that. We're not saying this is conditional, but we expect that there will be, support that flows, because this is beyond that which can be carried by the policies that are already there and approved. Something more needs to be done. We've got the target on the table, and hoping that the necessary resource, will come. That brings us to the end of the presentation. But also noteworthy is the fact that this will require a just transition. And we do have a Presidential Climate Commission that was launched last year and started its work, in March of the current year. And that commission is working on the just, energy transition vision for the country, from which we all will take the cue. And of course, there are other pieces of work like your climate change bill that will enable, better action and so forth. Thanks. This brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steleki, for taking us through South Africa's NDC and giving us some insight into the enhanced ambition, as well as the structure and focus areas of that commitment. I'd now like to call upon Ms. Geraldine Morris, who's from Business Unity South Africa, really to talk to the importance of business leadership in making sure that South Africa can actually enhance ambition. Geraldine, you're welcome to come through and give us a few insights on the role of business. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. 1 second. And good afternoon, I guess, to those of you online. I think certainly in South Africa, we're in afternoon already. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Business has given strong support for the NDC update for increased ambition. And this is important. I mean, we've seen over the last sort of year to 18 months, the signs of the recent IPCC support that shows that we're nowhere near reaching the kind of mitigation levels that we need to meet. Given the evidence that we saw through the Presidential Climate Change Commission from April through to about June this year, that showed that we can actually increase our ambition with current policies and measures, as the previous presentation showed. And I think also, given the level of our current emissions as a country, and given more particularly the threats to our economy, to our exports, and the opportunities, the very real opportunities that we can see as a country if we increase our ambition in terms of dealing with climate change. I think we have to pause for a moment and really just applaud the work that's been put into consulting on the updating of our nationally determined contributions as a country. DFFE has held multiple bilateral engagements and multi-engagements. Again, this has been mentioned, both at a provincial level, as I said, a bilateral engagement with all the social partners, including business. The Presidential Climate Change Commission also, as I mentioned, held a series of dialogues which really helped unpack and broaden the understanding for the NDCs and the need for increased ambition. And I think this was really important because it allowed South African public, all of the social partners, including business, to properly engage with the NDC and understand what was required and what was required from the process. As part of the efforts that we have undertaken as a country or need to undertake as a country going forward for our economic recovery and growth, the enhanced ambition will help us leverage these opportunities in the sectors, particularly where there is significant potential for decarbonization and growth. For example, we know, and Steve will talk to this, I think, a bit more in terms of the work that the NBI has done in partnership with BUSA and BCG. There is significant potential for reducing emissions in the power sector. We must also recognize, though, that there are some sectors and some industries that have more difficult processes to decarbonize. But in being one of the first movers on increasing our ambition on those sectors where there is early potential, it means that we are allowing those sectors the time to work through the technical feasibility of what they can do to decarbonize. It also allows us time to unpack and fully develop to ensure that we have a just transition across all sectors of our economy, which is also hugely important. And here the private sector has a key role to play. We need to be working with stakeholders, including government, NGOs, civil society, academia, to unpack what are the potentials going forward and where we can make a difference in terms of these emissions. It also importantly allows our government time to develop proper, aligned, and well-designed policies and measures that can create an enabling framework for policy that we need to achieve enhanced ambition and realize the goals that we see in our NDC and going beyond the NDC towards net zero in 2050. I think I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take any additional follow-ups, but I think most of the devil in the detail will be unpacked in Steve's following remarks. Thank you very much. Are you coming up here, Steve? Or are you sitting there?
Thank you very much, Geraldine, for helping me so much in my work by making sure that Steve is up and ready and really to present on the detail of how the power sector in South Africa can contribute to decarbonizing South Africa's overall economy. There's a lot of work that's been done by the partners that Geraldine has mentioned, and we're very pleased to give you some detailed insight into how this work has unfolded and what the outcomes were, as well as where we feel support is required to actually implement and realize the ambition. Steve, you're welcome to come through.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so the session is really thinking about stakeholder engagement and the role that played and how we got to our power plan. So I'm going to throw in some personal reflections as I go, particularly for those of you that might have seen this presentation before. Let me take this off. So a couple of key things that came up during the process. Effect base is critical. One of the big barriers that we needed to overcome in South Africa was this idea that the just transition could not be achieved. And that was a narrative you heard often. Oh, it's too difficult. We have too much coal. And so providing that fact base, providing that guidance to say, well, this can be achieved. It can be achieved within the timelines was really critical. You needed to run the process with as much inclusion as possible. So I should mention that the process run here was largely a business process, but we tried to include as many stakeholders as we could. So we had people from all sorts of backgrounds in our expert working groups, and I'll talk to that a little bit just now. And then I think critically, and it was mentioned earlier by Mkhutazi, is the role of the Presidential Climate Commission in the stakeholder process. And so what you had in South Africa in the build-up to a more ambitious NDC was several different parties all trying to understand what the process would look like, which technologies, which timing. And the Presidential Climate Commission, as an independent body established by the president, played a really critical role in sort of aligning those views and finding out where the unity was and driving that conversation forward. So that independent process, I think, was also very critical. Leadership is very important, leadership from the business sector as a whole, but also individuals within the sector. Recognizing the risk is exogenous was a big step. So moving away from how do we solve this as a South Africa to where do we sit in the global context was also a really important moment in this transition. Recognizing that global economies were going to change no matter what we did in South Africa, and that imposed particular risks on our country and therefore required a response we also felt was a really big first step. Obviously, mentioned by Geraldine and others, the just transition is important. How do you put people in the center of this transition? We've got a few slides on that. And then really just to conclude that this is only the beginning. So we're really excited as a country about a more ambitious NDC. We're really excited about the big support deal that was announced earlier in the week. But this is only the beginning. Now we have to drill down into the detail, and that will take equally a multi-stakeholder collaborative process. So a couple of highlights on the project. So this is a project that NBI, Boston Consulting Group, and Business Unity South Africa did together to try to understand what these pathways look like sector by sector. And importantly, it's rooted in the science. We accept that the science demands of us that we meet the 1.5 degree goal, and that requires net zero by 2050, but also operate within a fair share budget, which we think about roughly as 8 gigatons. Obviously, there's a range on that. And this realization that global economies were responding to their science by making more ambitious NDCs, many countries committing to net zero by 2050, and how that would change their trade patterns as well as the kind of commodities that they procure and trade was a big first step. And so if you look at South Africa's trading partners and those that have committed to net zero, you can see the bulk of our trading partners have committed to net zero, with the EU already talking about border tariff adjustments. And South Africa being a very emissions intensive economy, trading things like steel on international markets means that we're incredibly vulnerable to those border tariff adjustments. But the picture is particularly stark if you drill down into the commodities that we trade and thinking about how future supply demand patterns will change. So the top 6 products that we export as a nation are platinum group metals, coal, iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, and the motor vehicle, effectively the internal combustion engine. So platinum group metals, a third of platinum group metal demand is used in the internal combustion engine. So items 1 and 6 under threat. Coal will be out of the economy, global economy by 2050. So that's under threat. Iron ore, gold, and ferroalloys in particular are only really competitive if they can find net zero solutions as well as get cheap energy input costs. And so the vulnerability of our economy to these exogenous risks is huge. And this basically represents a picture of our balance of payments. So any loss in export earnings means that we may struggle to pay debt, which means we may get credit rate downgrade, which means borrowing becomes more expensive, which means investing our way out of the problem becomes more expensive, and you end up in a vicious negative cycle. And so what the chief challenge is how do we turn these things around? How do we create opportunity out of this risk and maybe grow these bars? Certainly there are things that can't be replaced. Coal is out of the economy, but platinum group metals play a key role in hydrogen. And so how do we focus on hydrogen, both as an off-taker for platinum, but also as an export market in itself to perhaps replace things like coal? And so that was a lot of the discussion that we ran as we presented these business pathways to net zero. So what did the study aim to do? Work out what the cost of inaction was. Can we afford to do nothing? Answer is clearly no. What would it take to get to net zero emissions? What technologies, by when, with what kind of policy support, with what kind of international support? And then critically, in a South African context, which I'll talk about a bit more just now, is what are the socioeconomic implications of this transition? And they're enormous. So we weren't trying to prescribe to anybody. We weren't trying to say this is what you must do. We're really just trying to provide that fact base that allowed a much more open conversation about the transitions. And I think that point about not trying to prescribe to anyone was key to getting people engaged in the conversation. It was genuinely a conversation about what do we do, what are the major risks, and I'll talk a little bit about the governance. These are the sectors we focused on: electricity, petrochemicals, mining, transport, and agriculture, forestry, and land use are all largely done. And we'll do minerals and metals and manufacturing and construction, as well as a couple of modules on finance and integration early next year. Governance of the process was important. I talked about leadership, I talked about inclusiveness, and we had 3 kind of advisory steering bodies. We had a group of CEO champions from major South African corporates helping us think through how to politically position the work, what would be useful in their understanding of the process. We had an advisory board that was made up of government, labor, civil society, and a little bit of academics. And then we had a steering committee that was largely technical people from companies that were helping guide us around data availability and modeling approaches and so on. And then the real magic, I like to say, happened in these technical committees at the bottom. Every couple of weeks, we ran a very open, inclusive technical process. Anybody could come. We had labor unions attend. We had academics attend. We had civil society attend. Obviously, because it was a business-run process, most of the participants were from business, but there was this very open approach. And what we would do in these sessions is present our findings, present our data, present our model, present our assumptions, and have them critiqued by these stakeholders, gave us better assumptions, better data, better modeling. And so over time, granular, the more and more granular we got, the more comfortable we were with the outputs. This was the CEO leadership group that's convened for the project. And as I say, this project is ongoing and we continue to onboard new CEOs, but a really great mix of leadership within the country. People from the heavy emitters, Eskom, Sasol, and Exxaro, notably amongst those, people from the financial services sector, people from agriculture, forestry, and land use, people from petrochemicals. So a really great mix of both the economy, but also our emissions profile. So it was kind of the setup. So it was set up as very much as this inclusive and stakeholder-led approach, and then kind of got us to this discussion around just transition. And what I found personally very interesting in this process is listening to how stakeholders engage. And so the stakeholders, particularly from civil society and government, were very concerned with the just transition and distributional components of the transition, which is clear. But South Africa's problem is particularly stark. We have amongst the highest inequality in the world, if not the highest inequality in the world. We have incredibly high unemployment rates with 30% general unemployment and more than 50% of the youth unemployed. And in fact, if you take a broad definition of unemployment, that number is closer to 75% of youth unemployed. So inclusion in the economy of young people and of women and of unemployed people is obviously a very important part of this transition. And then 55% of South Africans live in poverty. So these are very stark numbers. And in fact, if you think about the data that's coming out of our agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, it's particularly interesting. And so those numbers on the left, I just want to focus on. And the average South African spends about 1,000 Rand per household on food per month. Whereas to get a nutritious basket of food that's sort of optimally for your family is 3,000 Rand a month. And so we're already way underspending. We have major structural challenges that are nothing to do with climate change that result in poverty and inequality. And then to get to a diet that is both nutritious as well as climate friendly, you need to get out to 4,000 Rand a month. And so almost 2/3 of the job is structural challenges within the economy and 1/3 of the job is climate change. But obviously they're intermingled. but to make the point that the underlying social issues in South Africa are really paramount and something that we have to manage simultaneously with climate change. And so our ultimate goal is to understand the labor force of today, to understand how many permanent, highly skilled, high income people are included in that labor force, what the level of unemployment is, and to deploy a suite of enablers and measures that move us to a labor force of the future that has more permanent, more highly skilled, more high income people and fewer unemployed people. And that's ultimately the goal. And that suite of enablers, it comes across a huge range. We have things around early retirement, policy measures, but really the ultimate thing that we have to do there is investment. And this is coming out in all of the modeling. And one of our project partners, IDRI, released a paper yesterday, in fact, that looks at the GDP growth that's required in order for us to make all of these changes, and it's in the 200% by 2050, right? So the level of investment, the level of growth that has to be built into the economy is enormous. And so that investment lens is something that is really important and came out in the stakeholder engagement continuously. But also that we can't just focus on jobs and on reskilling, which tends to be where we go when we think about just transitions. And so across the opportunities, across all of the sectors in the economy, we also have to think about things like social and ecological welfare. We have to think about managing geographic and cultural dislocation as communities move around. This is particularly relevant in the mining sector, where you have quite a lot of migrant labor, but also in agriculture and other sectors. We have to think about economic inclusion. I mentioned that we have to include women and we have to include the youth in this transition. Otherwise, we just exacerbate these underlying social challenges. We have to think about ownership. How do we transfer ownership from those who have to those who don't, as a particularly important driver of inequality? And one of the challenges we have there, and I always hear examples of Germany and in the UK, and my favorite example is in the UK, where they have a community-owned wind farm in Surrey, but the community are basically all retired investment bankers. They come with capital, they come with access. And so it's easy to transition to a community-owned power scheme in that context. In South Africa, the communities that require ownership have very low levels of education, very low levels of access to wealth, very low levels of access to the market and to employment. And so the challenge is far more difficult than it is in other parts of the world. And then there's a whole range of issues related to infrastructure and governance. So in particular, if we think about South African rural communities, quite often many of the services that are provided to local communities are provided by companies partnering with the local municipality. So for example, in the mining sector, there are areas where the wastewater treatment and the waste management and the water treatment are run by the local mines. And not by the local municipalities. And so as you transition out of those mines, and particularly in case the coal mining sector, you create weaknesses again within the local municipality and the service delivery to communities. And so this is kind of the complexity of the just transition that has to be built into this conversation. And in this sort of stakeholder engagement, we find that we hear this a lot from civil society communities, from parts of government, and it's probably something that doesn't get enough attention in the global and local discourse. So that was kind of the setup and how the project was run. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of the outputs to just give you a sense of where you can go and kind of re-emphasize that point that I made earlier. If you're going to show to people that it can be done, show the detail of how and when it can be done, you get a lot more buy-in without that sort of fact base. So in South Africa, as was mentioned earlier, our energy rollout schedule is managed by a policy document called the IRP, and the IRP shows a decline in coal anyway, the sort of gray bar in this chart, but an increase in demand. And so the key issue is this orange bar, the gap between demand and how we plan to supply. And the question we then try to answer in the project is, how do we do that and supply that gap in as efficient a way as possible? If we're talking seriously about net zero, that last gray bar in the chart would be a stranded asset. That would effectively be two big coal-fired power plants in South Africa called Reduc and Kusile, and they would either have to have some kind of carbon capture and storage, which we're fairly skeptical about, or you would have to close those power plants early. But more on that a little bit later. So what we did was we built a Plexos model. Plexos is an energy modeling software that our local utility called Eskom use, but it's a global standard and a sort of good starting point. So we built a Plexos model of the South African energy system, and we looked at 3 archetypes of energy that reflected the dominant conversations that were being had in South Africa at the time. So we started this work about 12 to 18 months ago. And really the conversations that were happening within society was, can you move to a renewable energy dominant system? Can you manage a coal and carbon capture utilization and storage system? Or can you have a nuclear energy dominant system? Really worrying about this idea of base load. And so what we did once we modeled all of these systems, what you can observe is that the cheapest system for South Africa is a renewable energy system. And that, of course, if you think back to that first chart that I showed of balance of payments, and that is important for other sectors to be competitive. And so energy in South Africa is not only really important, or power, because it is a heavy emitter in itself, because we're so coal-based, but it is also the driver of decarbonization for many other sectors. And so from just a purely cost and economics perspective, the renewables dominant system is the logical choice for the country. But even when you look at a whole bunch of variables and sensitivities, and this we got from our stakeholder engagement. So as I mentioned, we present this to an expert group. The expert group would say, did you think about this? And what about that? And they try to catch us out. And that was perfect, right? And so what we did then was we tested all of these sensitivities for a range of input variables, and the renewable energy system for any comparable point is always the cheapest option for power in South Africa. So how do you get to net zero, right? So now we know that renewable energy is the system that you would choose. How you get to net zero then, what you would get from the current roughly 200 megatons a year down to 70 megatons just by building renewable energy and closing down coal on schedule. And to get from 70 megatons a year down to about 16, you have to overbuild renewables. So you have to build some renewable redundancy into the system. And to get from there to net zero, you would either have to use a combination of gas and direct air capture and storage, or hydrogen, right? Much more expensive options for the economy if you look at those marginal abatement costs, but well within global carbon price estimates for those periods. So you can implement these pathways in a number of ways. And so we looked at 2 bookend scenarios, sort of the extremes of how you would consider these pathways. And one was we let the model optimize for emissions, right? So we ran that Plexos model optimizing for net zero by 2050. And what you end up is closing those coal-fired power plants in 2042, which is very closely aligned with the International Energy Agency's assessments of around 2040. The other scenario ran was aligning it with existing policy. So pretty much the slowest decarbonization route to 2050. So we stranded those 2 coal power plants I mentioned, Medupi and Kusile, but otherwise followed the decommissioning schedule of the IRP. And obviously then we can compare the 2 scenarios. And so you'll see in the least emissions scenario, big ramping down of coal and the purple band, coal out by 2042, whereas in the IRP pathway, this runs out close to 2050. With some significant investment in gas, depending on whether you bet on direct air capture or not, and then towards the end of the half century, an investment in hydrogen. But the bulk of the transition is done with this sort of turquoise bar, which is focused on renewable energy and renewable energy rollout. If you look at price, so because in the least emissions pathway, you're investing in renewable energy earlier on, you're not necessarily getting advantage of all of the learning curves. You see that the price for power is slightly more expensive, somewhere between 2 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour up until 2040. And then obviously as the energy mixes start to align towards an optimized net zero by 2050 energy mix, then they sort of normalize. And that's not a particularly onerous cost to bear on the economy, particularly given all of the other benefits that come from this decarbonized power system and the competitiveness that enables across other sectors. But perhaps the most important point is this one at the bottom here, which looks at the cumulative carbon emissions or contribution to the carbon budget of the sector between the 2 comparisons. So you've got 3.5 gigatons for the least emissions pathway and 4.3 gigatons for the IRP pathway. So what's important here is, as you recall at the beginning, I mentioned we work on about 8 gigatons as a good rule of thumb for what a fair share carbon budget for the country would be. And so 1 gigaton is actually a very big share of that. And if you think about on top of power, you also have petrochemicals, which requires about 1.3 gigatons. You have transport, which requires somewhere around 1.3 to 1.5 gigatons. You've got iron and steel, which require half a gigaton, and you're quickly eating up that carbon budget. And so to create space for new things to invest in and for new commodities that you need to export to secure the economy, this gigaton saving by closing down power plants early is an important measure in enhancing our economy and something that we would recommend. Critical to the conversation in South Africa, if you talk to any stakeholder, doesn't matter what sector they come from, and you ask them what their key priority is, their answer will be jobs. Whether they're business, whether they're labor, whatever, jobs is the key driver. And so when we looked at this data, what is interesting is that the jobs that are gained from the construction and operating and maintenance of renewable energy is greater than the jobs lost in coal. And so that's a good story. There are some components to this that require further investigation. So for example, the job gains are not necessarily the same type of jobs, not necessarily the same permanence and the same remuneration, but there are net more jobs available for the country, and we now need to do the detail on how do we create that job bar even bigger. So what's not in here, for example, is localization of energy components, which can be added onto that. So what you end up at the end of the day is this really great stakeholder conversation around power, about what's possible and what necessary pathways are, and some convergence on the idea that we need to scale down emissions in the power sector as fast as we can in order to create opportunities in other sectors. And the key variables are more jobs created in the renewable energy pathway and more jobs created earlier in the least emissions pathway than in the IRP pathway, cumulative emissions significantly lower, but in some regards also better capex profiles in the least emissions pathway against the slightly more expensive power in the IRP pathway. And so then what that enables us to do is to identify key outcomes that you need in the 3 critical decades between now and 2050. What do we need to do in the first decade? What do we need to do in the second? And what do we need to do in the third? And that translated then into a whole series of no regret decisions, things that we can do now that enable us to transition quicker and faster as the decades roll out. I'm not going to go into this for very much detail, but the value of this is we reached this point with a fair amount of stakeholder alignment. And what was useful in the stakeholder engagement sessions was to pay attention to what people didn't like. And so we know, for example, that there's still quite a lot of stakeholder discord around the role of gas in the energy system. We know there's a lot of stakeholder interest around jobs and how you cater for jobs in the transition. And so that gives us a lot of guidance for where we go next in the project. So just to highlight where you can get more of this information. So we are releasing these reports as sector reports as they're ready. The decarbonizing power system is available, and decarbonizing petrochemicals and decarbonizing mining are also available. You can find them on the NDI website, and we will be releasing a report. So it looks like I'll be releasing 2 reports on gas in the next couple of weeks, but we'll also be releasing one on transport and agriculture, forestry, and land use towards the end of this year or early next year. And we encourage you to look at those. So thank you, everybody, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that detailed description of the work that the NDI has been undertaking in partnership with Business Unity South Africa as well as BCG to really understand at a very detailed level what is needed to decarbonize the power sector. We will now be taking questions from the floor, which both Steve and Geraldine are on hand to answer. I would request that you please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will allow you to come forward to the podium, and both Steve and Geraldine can address any particular questions that have been raised. Are there any questions from the floor? Please come forward. Steve and Geraldine, you may use the microphone on the table there.
Hi, Steve, the question is basically directed at you at your presentation. Just around the issue of renewables. I'm not sure whether I missed it. I didn't get the question of battery technology in the introduction of renewables so that it can provide a stable power generation for the grid. If you can expand on that, please.
Sure. Yeah, great question. And I did gloss over that a little bit quickly in the presentation. But yeah, in order to enable renewables, you need a couple of other technologies that help with flexibility and peaking support. And in particular, batteries are really important to deal with short-term sort of variability cycles. The one challenge we have that's come up in the work, and that is being hotly debated still, is the role of gas. So on top of the role of batteries, there may also be a need for the role of gas in order to support peaking in particular, and obviously to meet net zero targets, to phase that out by 2050 and try to keep usage as low as possible. But batteries are key. And then as you get towards the end of 2045, also then hydrogen to play a similar role for that peaking support. So the three technologies work together, renewables, batteries, and then some form of peaking support, either gas or hydrogen at this stage. There may be other options.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yep, the floor is still open. If there are any other questions that people would like to have addressed, you're welcome to come forward and present your question.
Hi, sorry I missed some of the presentation, but I just caught some of it at the end. So just taking the current reality, we know we've messed up badly on coal, and finally there's some kind of light for divestment in coal. And my sense is that it's going to be too late with oil and gas if we don't start shutting that down now. And for example, one of the sponsors, Shell, we just learned is going to do a 6,000 exploration on the wild coast of South Africa, amongst all of the other Sasol and other companies. And our feeling is that if we allow these projects to go on, obviously they're long-term projects, emissions will continue for a long time. And I may have missed the slide around that part of the transition, but generally our sense is as long as we allow that to happen, we're definitely going to overshoot, because ultimately it's not just South Africa's commitments, but it's the consolidation of all of the commitments, and South Africa being the 14th largest emitter plays a big role. So just any thoughts on that? Thank you.
So could you please quickly introduce yourself for the people online? So you missed it. Could you please introduce yourself quickly for the people online?
So my name is Puvan Mudri, and I'm with an organization called Natural Justice, and we work with indigenous and local communities.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Geraldine, if you want to comment, but I can kick off. I mean, these are key issues. So the two things we have to manage in this transition is, on the one hand, the net zero date, which should be 2050, but also then the carbon budget, which is kind of what you're speaking to, is we have to stay within this fair share. And so if we make decisions now that lock in emissions for a longer period, obviously that really curtails our ability to meet that carbon budget. So our view on oil and gas is that the role of oil and gas in South Africa is fairly limited, and we think that the oil refineries in South Africa will probably close somewhere around 2030. Some studies are showing later dates, 2036, some earlier. We think it might be possible that it's earlier. And so we think that that role of oil in cars is going to be constrained, and in transport. And therefore, we need to invest in other things like battery electric vehicles, and to the earlier question batteries, not only for the power sector. And then the role of gas also is relatively limited. We do struggle to find an alternative for gas in peaking and power. So we think there is a role for gas probably out to 2050, but diminishing quite significantly after the mid 2030s. But certainly probably not any role for new gas, new oil, new exploration, more likely imported gas from port terminals, just to meet that demand that you need in the power sector, and perhaps in some industry applications where you can switch to gas as opposed to a more emitting fuel like coal.
Thanks. I think probably just echoing a lot of what you've covered already, Steve, but yes, we also believe that there is a role, albeit limited, but it's really part of the steps we need to take to reduce our emissions, but certainly not not in the end mix that we see in terms of the energy sources for the economy post 2050. But we do believe it's needed as part of the transition.
So thank you very much for the questions that have been raised thus far. We are still taking a few questions, both in person and online. So I'm going to give an opportunity to those who are also online to voice their questions. But in the interim, if there are any additional questions from the in-person audience, you're welcome to raise your question and just come forward to use the microphone and share your question. And I do apologize for not asking you to introduce yourself. So the first speaker was Mr. Mongezi Veti from Exaro, and we've had a subsequent question as well from Mr. I think it's Kabin Naidu as well, who's joined in. So the question from the online audience, so if you'll just give me 1 second, just to bring it up. Okay, so we've had a question from some of the participants online and to the two speakers. Could the three technologies, renewables, batteries, and gas also be used for other African countries? So if you're happy to just share a few thoughts on that, you're welcome.
So I guess what we learned from this process is every country has a relatively unique journey and needs to do that detailed work for themselves. So it's hard to say. It depends on what your starting mix is. It depends on what other resources you have. So obviously countries in Central Africa have better access to hydro and therefore are going to be less reliant on wind and solar, which has different implications for the kinds of flexibility support that you need. So I guess that would be the first thing. Certainly in Southern Africa as a SADC region, there's an opportunity for power pools and for sharing power. So obviously the bigger the surface area you can spread your renewable energy grid across, the less susceptible it is to variabilities in weather, because you have more redundancy in the system and a bigger system. And then obviously peaking support can be provided across different parts of the region with something like gas more efficiently if you have a centralized gas infrastructure. But that requires a significant investment in the SADC regional grid, which doesn't yet have happening, but it is something that the regional power pool is talking about. So I, not having a fantastic answer to that question, but that's sort of my reflex.
Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts, Steve. We're happy to take a few more questions. If there are any questions, both in person as well as online, we can give a few just minutes to those. So I'm not seeing any hands coming up.
Maybe I can ask just a quick question of Geraldine. So Geraldine leads BUSA climate team, which is effectively the business body that's mandated to talk to government. And maybe you can talk just a little bit about how that works internally within BUSA. What are kind of structures you put in place in order to push business to more ambitious positions, and where things like this project helped, and maybe some other influences that you think were maybe important.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, so Business Unity South Africa is the apex business organization. So we speak on behalf of business in statutory structures, particularly in South Africa, social compacting structures, things like that. So within BUSA, we have different committees. We have an environment subcommittee, an energy subcommittee, and we've actually formed specifically a just transition working group within BUSA. This kind of work actually cuts across all of those structures. So in a very collaborative way with our members, who themselves are normally business associations, chambers, unisectoral associations, things like that, we've engaged with them to inform the policy position that we need to take as BUSA. So what we strive always to do is to have our policy positions based on evidence, so technical fact-based as far as possible. And that is why we collaborated with NBI and BCG on this work. So towards informing how we engage on behalf of business in the development of policy on climate change and the just transition and the just energy transition, we needed this kind of work to help as a fact base. We've also tried to create a platform to broaden our members' understanding, and this has also played an important role in this space. So what we've done is we've collaborated to have kind of information sharing platforms. With the lockdown, that's actually been really helpful in that sense, because virtually, or holding sessions virtually, should I say, means that we've had a lot more participation than we have had previously. So there's a bit of a silver lining there. But again, really just to broaden the understanding of members and help ensure that everybody is making informed inputs across the board. So a lot of what we've done is to try and educate members as well, but also take on board their learning. So a lot of our members do have very rich technical experience and engagements in this space. So just fostering that kind of dialogue and engagement. I mentioned in my remarks earlier that in terms of the NDC and the just transition and this kind of work specifically, the Presidential Climate Commission has played a key role. They've really opened up a lot of dialogues for voices that I think we haven't been used to hearing. And again, I think their virtual platforms has helped that a lot as well. So that's been really, really useful. And I know from our members, there's been really positive feedback about that and the engagement. And we actually, as business, moved. Initially we supported the updated NDC, which was slightly less ambitious than what we've put forward now under the UNFCCC. And we did support that kind of as a, yes, we think we can do this with a bit of caution, but through the work that NBI has done, through the PCC dialogue, sorry, not challenges, our understanding has evolved as well to the point where we proactively then supported and encouraged government to take on more ambition in the NDC, because we felt that we could really leverage off a lot of opportunities and also play our role towards contributing our fair share in terms of mitigation efforts. So yeah, I think, putting people, even in a business perspective, having people at the center of it is really important to have that understanding and those dialogues. Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, there was a key moment in this journey of trying to get agreements on the NDC where business put out a joint statement. So it was BUSA leading with NBI supporting on what business felt ambition levels should be. And in that document, supported net zero by 2050, but also supported a more enhanced ambition with the NDC. And I think that was an important part of the sort of overall dialogue and us moving towards this enhanced NDC.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Geraldine, just for giving us a window into that entire process. And I think it's quite heartening, again, to learn how information in this particular case has empowered great ambition. And we look forward to, I think, more of those reports coming out from the NBI and that prolonged process. to allow as much engagement and transparency as possible and allow us to build an information base that can further empower ambition and action. So thank you very much for those insights and those comments. We still have a few minutes open. If we do have any additional questions from the floor, I'm quite happy to take those now. But in the absence of those questions, just to alert everyone, I think both in person and those who are joining online, that the reports that have been detailing the various sector transitions, at least the options and some of those key decision points, are available on the NBI website. So people are welcome to just look on the website and get some more detailed information on the work that's been taking place. And for those that are here, that on the walls of the pavilion as well, we have summarized some of those key outcomes from the different sectoral pieces of work that have been undertaken. I think with that, I don't see any further questions, but just to note that we have a full day of events, just talking to the just transition, understanding in more detail what different stakeholders are doing to contribute to South Africa's NDC, that there is more opportunity to understand how we're working in this particular area. So thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing both what happens behind the scenes as well as the various outcomes of the work that's been taking place through the Just Transition study. We really do appreciate that. And we welcome the audience and encourage them to engage a bit further, both in person here at the COP, as well as through the NBI website and the various reports that we've published on this particular topic. Thank you very much for joining us. I think we can now declare the session closed.